All right, hello there. Today we are going to talk a little bit about microbes in their environment, and actually very specifically prokaryotes in their environment. And we're going to think about this in terms of some environmental conditions, and then also in terms of the human microbiome. And there is another video that goes along with this one about the microbiome and an assignment as well. But let's get to that once we go over some of the initial information. Okay, so to start out, we really want to think about the different stuff that we've got here. So let's think about some of the different ways that bacteria interact with their environment and the conditions that would affect them the most. So there's a variety of different things that would affect bacteria when you think about the environment around them. One of those things is definitely temperature. Some bacteria do well at just about any temperature, at least any sort of standard temperature. Some prefer warmer, cooler, and some can do very extreme temperatures. Another key one is the pH. Acidity makes a fairly big difference in the ability of bacteria and archaea to survive. Oxygen is important. Different species need oxygen, and some of them do not. Let me spell oxygen correctly. Oxygen. So that's another key concept in terms of the environment. Another one that we should think about is nutrients. So bacteria need various kinds of nutrients, and actually specifically they're going to need a carbon source or something to eat. They're going to need some various kinds of ions, and they're probably going to need some micronutrients such as nitrogen, phosphate, sulfate, things like that. So phosphorus and sulfur are also key to the survival of microorganisms. So all of these are definitively important things. There's a few more that you think of. Moisture or water content is one of them, because you need a certain amount of moisture to survive, and some are better in drier conditions and some are better in essentially wetter conditions. There's also substrate, or essentially the thing that you are on. So that could be a physical surface. So the physical environment that you're attached to can make a big difference to a bacteria. It can also relate to the environmental conditions such as light and UV. So for some of them, light is important, and for some of them, UV can be a problem if there's too much exposure. So these are all key things that are going to play a role in how we think about bacteria and how they survive under different conditions. So let's think about that in terms of bacteria into different types of environments, just so we can get the sense of what it might be like. So let's say we have an environment that lives in a lake, a bacteria that lives in a lake, and like the upper area of a lake where you would actually easily be able to access. And let's say that that's going to be fairly different from a bacteria that lives, for example, in groundwater, which would be maybe at least 12 to 15 feet below the surface. So if we think of each of these things, we can certainly see how it's going to make a huge difference in the bacteria. Temperature, for instance, a lake is going to be much warmer, depending on where it is. It might get cold as well. There might be some adjustments, or variable. Groundwater is going to be cold, pretty much straight up. It only has one fairly simple temperature. pH might vary amongst them depending on where you're at. A lot of times groundwater pH could be different. Lake pH could be somewhat neutral if you have a good buffered lake, or if you're up in the Adirondacks, it could be very acidic. You never know. Oxygen can be a big differentiator. In a lake, you're likely to have increased O2. It's pretty much always there in the water, but in groundwater, you're likely to have almost no O2. And in fact, many of the bacteria that live deep underground are not just oxygen. They don't just not use oxygen, they're fully oxygen intolerant. They can't handle it at all, which is kind of interesting. In a lake, you probably have pretty high levels of all the nutrients that you need. You have carbon substances, you have different stuff. There can be lower nutrient lakes, but either way, there's still vegetation and things around. In groundwater, there's very little. So depending on what's available, different bacteria might be completely unable to grow or have to find different ways to get nutrients. Obviously, both of these have moisture. They're going to have some fairly different types of substrate, though. So a lake is a very wet and soft type of substrate. Things might be living on dirt particles, on plants, or floating in the water. Whereas in groundwater, the most likely place the bacteria are living is actually on the rocks. And so it would have a solid type of surface to attach to, and they would also need to be able to hold on to those rocks. And then obviously the lake has significantly increased light, but then also UV to deal with, and groundwater has none, so light can't be a factor at all. So you can imagine how bacteria would be different in these different situations, and indeed, you definitely have completely different populations and communities living in the upper areas of a lake versus deep under the ground. So when we think about this, mostly we're trying to say, well, what would bacteria need? What would they be able to do? What kind of adaptations might they have? And what species might you find? Okay, so now that we get the idea of how all of this works, now let's think about this in terms of the human microbiome. So first of all, the human microbiome is, of course, all of the bacteria that make up a human. So we'll clear all of this up. And the bacteria on and in our bodies are fairly numerous. In fact, there's at least as many of them as there are human cells. We used to think it was a lot more of them, but more recent research and trying to estimate bacterial numbers and things like that is very difficult, but at least as many bacteria as human cells between the different places that they reside and the amount of turnover they go through. They reside in a lot of places in the human body. So we already know a little bit about how they can be in our stomachs because we talked a little bit about Helicobacter. We know that they can be in our intestines and are often involved in various parts of digestion. Other places you might or might not think about them being, they definitely play roles in on our skin ecosystems. And the skin in different places is different. So they can be on our skin, but for example, the bacteria living in the skin of your armpits going to be very different from the skin of your actual arm surface, going to be very different from the skin on your face. And so all of those are essentially very different environments. There's a significant amount of bacteria that live in the vagina if you have one, as well as in other orifices. There's a whole set of bacteria that live in your mouth. And I think I may have included at least one other on the assignment sheet, but these are the things I want you to think about is how are these places a little bit different when we compare some of those concepts from before. All right, so for example, let's think about just pH for a moment. We know the stomach is very acidic. But other places, like, for example, the intestines, might be more neutral to basic. So depending on exactly where you are in the intestines, they change a little bit. You're going to have completely different populations living in those places. What about something like oxygen? You'll have a lot of oxygen if you're out on a surface. Like, for example, on a skin surface, you're going to have a significant amount of oxygen. So maybe you'll have increased O2 in these places. But in the intestines, you've significantly decreased O2. So when trying to think about all of the different conditions, your goal is to name the things that are specific to those areas. Not everything will have something, but being able to say, oh, for example, bacteria that live on the skin might not have an awful lot of nutrient choice. They pretty much have the oils your skin produces and skin cells themselves, and that's not much. But the bacteria that live in your mouth and your stomach and your intestines have a lot of nutrients coming at them, so they have a lot more options, and also they can change with the different nutrients. So when you're going through these, those are the things that you should be thinking about and writing down is how do these different environments work, which ones have more nutrients, which have less, which have a condition that a bacteria would need to adapt to, like a lack of oxygen, which ones have different places for them to live. So the ones on the surface of our skin are also exposed more. They have less protection and are trying to grab onto it's not exactly a rocky substrate, but it is a drier substrate. Whereas the ones in our mouth have it pretty easy. They just get to grab onto stuff, hold on tight, and lots of nutrients and liquids come by all the time. So those are a number of the things to think about. We also want to think about what the benefits of these bacteria actually are to us. Now, some of them are fully beneficial when we have organisms that have benefits, and they benefit both sides. So in this case, they benefit both the bacteria and us. We call that a mutualism. So mutualism is two things benefit. Where do we have some mutualistic interactions? Well, specifically, our intestines have a lot of mutualistic interactions because we feed the bacteria and they produce vitamins for us. So there's bacteria that produce, for example, vitamin K. We have a pretty good mutualism for those of you who have a vagina with the bacteria in the vagina because, again, we give them a safe, protected, warm area to live. And they produce acid, which in turn keeps out other pathogens. So these are places where we have a lot of good back and forth. You can also have a situation where one side benefits and the other kind of is just doing their thing. So that would be a commensalism. You might think of the bacteria who live on a lot of our surfaces perhaps that way. We don't necessarily always directly benefit from them, but they benefit from having us as a substrate. In some cases, we do benefit a little bit because they keep out some of the bad bacteria, but there's a pretty good chance that our skin isn't going to pick up a lot of crazy stuff unless you actually have a cut or a way into where all the nutrients are. Many times, the bacteria in our stomach are commensal, as in the helicobacter that live there. We know they can cause ulcers in people, but many people they don't, and they're just hanging out. They might be beneficial, but it's a little bit hard to tell. And then finally, there's neutralism, which is where everybody is just fine and nobody really helps anybody else. And it's likely that the bacteria on our bodies are mostly beneficial, but there are certainly plenty that could be living in various places where they don't bother us, we don't bother them, and everybody lives happily. So those are all really important aspects of how we live symbiotically and beneficially with our bacteria. Now, that's not the only thing that happens. So the other thing that I want you to consider is what can happen when you get things out of balance and the relationship is no longer beneficial to both parties. So out of balance, instead of symbiosis, a lot of times we would call that a dysbiosis. But since two things are still living together, it's technically a symbiotic relationship, even if it's a dysbiosis. But let's talk about what can go wrong in some of these instances. So we've already discussed the stomach as a possibility of where something can go wrong because Helicobacter pylori live in the stomach, but sometimes and in some people, and we don't know really what conditions cause this, instead of playing nice, they cause sores in the stomach. They burrow in too much, they cause the lining to be damaged, and they can be implicated in diseases such as ulcers and stomach cancer. And that's a problem. So it's a little bit complicated. In that type of instance, the Helicobacter aren't specifically, in most cases, overgrowing or trying to take over. They're just doing their thing and it's causing us a problem. One of the things we might call that is an amensalism, meaning that one of the two creatures is just kind of neutral, that would be the Helicobacter, and one is harmed, and that would be the human. Now, sometimes in our intestines, though, we actually get bacteria that are problematic and pathogenic or parasites, and they have a parasitism, which means that they're benefiting from our downside. So when they benefit, it hurts us in very specific ways. So when we change the environment of our intestines, perhaps by adding a different food source, or in some cases by destroying the bacteria that live there normally through antibiotics, you can get things like Clostridium to grow, and you end up with C. diff. C. diff is definitely a parasitism because at that point, the C. diff is trying to take over. It will do nothing but keep growing. And when it does that, it causes dysfunction in the human, and we are no longer able to properly digest our food. And so the parasitism, let me add that, really makes that a difference. So there's a number of other places where the environment can get funky and change things. Our skin environment can change. So if you have different kinds of oils or different chemicals in your sweat at any given time, different bacteria might grow and they might change the way that things are reacting, or they might produce a chemical that smells differently than you're expecting. If they find an open wound, they might find their way in. In the vagina, if you kill off the bacteria that are there through, again, like antibiotics, or in some cases overwashing, you can have a dysbiosis in which now they're not there to protect the location and fungi find their way in. And interestingly enough, some of the same thing can happen in the mouth. So you also should think about when these things are in dysbiosis. Now, these are a lot of fine lines. There are definitely some places where bacteria are helpful to a point and then could become harmful. Or it could be related to our environment or our internal genetics, that accidentally we produce something that causes them to overgrow or causes the wrong ones to grow. So if we eat one kind of food, you get one type of population, a different kind, a different population, and perhaps both populations can make our digestion work, or one of them throws it off. And so it's difficult and complicated to think about this, but it is a way to consider how the human interacts with the microorganisms associated with us, and that's our human microbiome. It also makes you think about the different habitats these guys live in and whether or not we want to change those habitats. So providing different food sources, substrates, changing the oxygen levels will make a difference. And then also thinking about the different types of relationships that microbes have with both other microbes and with their host organisms. So both mutualistic and commensalistic, where people are benefiting relationships, but then relationships that can be harmful, such as the amensalism and the parasitism. All right, I hope you have picked up some useful information and can think your way through all of the environmental conditions for all of the human locations and a little bit more about some of the dysbioses for the assignment.